statements that make absolutely no sense. So, ladies and gentlemen, chairperson, esteemed opposition, proposition, and of course the floor. This evening I'd like to discuss this motion by first of all looking at children as a specialised population, and second of all looking at the nature of evil and good. So indeed, let's jump right into our first aspect and indeed the first point. As Daniel mentioned, children learn from children's entertainment precisely because they are most emotionally invested when they are looking at entertainment, because it portrays something that does not happen in their own lives. We do not deny this. In fact, this motion and the opposition are not saying that happily ever afters and that good should overwhelmingly triumph evil in all cases. What we are saying, however, is that this should happen in most cases. We are not denying in any way the true fictional evil offers the multiplicity of evil and harrowing colours, and that it can help children experience morality beyond the scope of reality. No, we are not denying this. What we are saying, however, is what is the alternative? Which leads me to my second point. The alternative to an overwhelming narrative of good triumphing evil, i.e. this idea of a happy ending, would be that we would present good triumphing evil to the same extent that we portray evil triumphing good, so happy endings and sad endings in equal amount. This may appear initially very reasonable. However, as I'd like to point out, Daniel mentioned this idea of a safe space. In today's society, parents often do not watch television with their children. Therefore, if we are placing these in equal status, we are not showing children any sense of discrimination or differentiation. I'll take it later. In terms of learning to differentiate between what is right and wrong. Indeed, we are showing them what does and does not happen rather than what should happen. Yes?
Sorry, just on what you said there about presenting good and evil in the same capacity. We're not saying that, we're showing the nuance in between those emotions. Things like, all the in-betweens of good and evil, not so much the good and evil dichotomy.
Absolutely, that's true. But if you're showing movies like the same amount of movies with happy endings and the same amount with sad endings, the same amount with evil and the same amount with good, how are children to know which one is stronger, which one is better? We are not showing them any preference. We still would be to portray a narrative of evil, more so accompanying or overcoming good. Why is this bad? Because entertainment is fundamentally about enjoyment and going to this escapist world, this better world. But if this better world is where evil is stronger and better, what are we telling children? Are we not insinuating that they are therefore less stronger, less able to reach this ideal? Yes.
If you're suggesting an equal amount of bad endings and happy endings, why would children then get this mismatched proposal of what good versus evil is?
Well, that's what we're saying, that we should not have the same amount, that we should have more happy endings, that we should have good triumphing over evil to a greater extent. And the reason we believe that is, even if you do not believe that children as a specialist population are vulnerable to learning, you will all agree that we should offer the best quality children's entertainment. Indeed, happy endings. We are not saying that sad endings with evil triumphing good are not of good quality. We are simply saying that happy endings are of a better quality. And how so? Because if we look at the most timeless stories we have, whether it's Nemo or Cinderella, children love these. Why do they love these? Because it panders to their need for hope and security. Because indeed, thank you. It shows this idea that things are not as black and white as the proposition will have you know. And why are they not as black? Cinderella may go off with Prince Charming at the end, but she has deceived him, and that is a dynamic worthy of discussion. Indeed, this leads me to the second aspect of the debate, the nature of good and evil. Why do we think that this is so fundamentally important? First of all, good and evil coexist. The real difference between them is that one is empathy, one is lack of empathy, that these are not in fixed amount. The opposition therefore do not believe, as the proposition may believe, that good frequently triumphing over evil, i.e. happy endings, present a dichotomy of black and white, where these are separated rather than interlinked. In fact, for good to triumph in any circumstance, evil must first of all be exposed and explored in parallelism. Therefore, children will always be exposed to some form of evil. We would argue that portraying happy endings does far more for their imagination because, frankly, we live in a pretty messed up world. And having discussed this, I realize that the opposition indeed as having happy endings, we can have narratives that indeed may segregate characters. As Daniel pointed out, this idea of women being damsels in distress and men always coming to the rescue, this idea of fixed molds. We recognize that this approach is comparatively less nuanced than evil triumphing over good and happy endings with more complexity, as you have stated. However, This house does not believe that this character segregation is unresolvable and therefore sufficiently great a flaw to suggest that an overwhelming narrative of good triumphing evil, i.e. happy endings, is less plausible than a narrative of evil triumphing good, i.e. sad endings. In fact, having discussed this nature and interplay of good versus evil and children as a specialized population, I can kind of feel the proposition coming up with this point of rebuttal. They may say, well, in the same way that evil is destructive because of a lack of a child's understanding or super hyped imagination, could we not say that good is also to be interpreted perhaps as an unattainable perfection, whereby children may experience a sense of prejudice towards other, or on the other spectrum, low self-esteem? I would say, fair point, bravo. However, given the innate structure of goodness as doing no harm, even if good was manipulated in this respect, and that if bad things became a byproduct of goodness, this would still produce far less destructive outcomes than pure evil itself, which leads us to the heart of the argument, indeed the nature of good versus evil. Since evil actions can occur without evil intentions, i.e. malevolence, evil can be considered a product of failure of intent to control oneself, the act of benevolence. Evil is thus semantically charged, and is a word we have come to label perpetrators beyond repair, for whom our justice is unmatchable and unmatched. In the end, it says more of the helplessness of the accuser than that of the transgressor. In fact, if we want evil to triumph, our only service is to do nothing. While this is an accurate thing to portray in children's entertainment and should not be ignored, we believe that an overwhelming amount of this shows children more about what they can't do than what they can do. In fact, this idea of good triumphing evil satisfies our need for justice and may indeed counteract the need of apathy that children may show to this type of entertainment. Since there's no better alternative to happy endings, and good triumphing evil is of better quality, I thank you for opposing.
We thank Naomi for her fine words, and I call on Sarah McCool for the proposition.
Before we begin, I just have to get on Twitter to tweet about how disappointed I am with the proposition speech, because that's how the U.S. does business these days. Right, hello. So before I begin my two main points, which are going to be about blurred lines and the reality of teaching children in the modern world, I'm going to start out with some points of rebuttal to the fine speech that was just given. And the first, and the one that I feel the most vehemently, is about escapism. Because if there's any specialized population in this world that doesn't need escapism, it's children. Because the imagination of a child is the best escapism that anyone in this world has ever needed. And in fact, children's entertainment like movies and music and television have been shown to destroy the capacity of a child to imagine and not to enable it, and that's an incredibly important point. My second point of rebuttal is that good and evil aren't portrayed in the way the opposition have suggested they are. They've suggested that there are these good people versus inherently evil people, and we're going to show that that's not true, that good people in films aren't necessarily good, but they've been labeled that way by the film industry to sell more films. So just to get right into blurred lines, I'm going to extend what Daniel said a little bit, because children have trouble telling what is real and what isn't real. The lines between fantasy and reality are often blurred. For instance, when I was a child, I thought that every family of actors on television was a legitimate family. Like, I couldn't tell the difference. So this is important because if we're giving children the overwhelming narrative of good versus evil here, there's no reason for them to believe that doesn't potentially happen in real life, which matters because that isn't true. There is no magic of good, which is what's portrayed in film and children's entertainment. We give children Disney and Harry Potter, where there's a hero and a villain, and good always triumphs over evil, but here's the thing, is that there's no magic or wand-waving or Albus Dumbledore in real life. There's no snap of the fingers, nothing changes, nothing to make good triumph over evil in the real world, and that's not the way that we portray good to children in entertainment. There's also a strong implication that we give children in the way that good triumphs over evil in children's entertainment. So Harry Potter has magical powers. Kids today don't. Harry Potter is really lazy and doesn't tend to work that hard. But if kids today want to get something done, if we want good to triumph over evil in our actual life, you need to work hard. There's no magical power that's going to come along and save you in the end. And if we're going to move on to Disney, in Disney, good always triumphs over evil through very little work. Someone's asleep the entire time in her own movie. And good often triumphs over evil in Disney films because good is just prettier than evil. which is horrendous in its own right. But also, presenting good as a quality that always triumphs over evil, we negate the hard work of the individual. And we need to teach children that the only reason good has ever triumphed over evil in real life is because people work together and they fight hard for what they believe in. Because as adults, we know that we would never protest with all of our hearts for the things that we believed in if we thought for a second that what we were protesting. So when we give children the perfect dichotomy of good versus evil, we give them something that they also can't live up to. They ask themselves, am I all good? Am I good enough? No one's all good. Dumbledore is considered a hero. He's all good, right? But he set Harry Potter up to die after 7 years of pretending to be a father figure to him, which is actually pretty shit if we're going to think about it in that way. Point of information.
Would you not argue that mirroring this idea of real hard work in movies can be beneficial? What is intrinsically wrong with this if children don't escape through it constantly?
I'm saying that that's not what's portrayed in movies. It's a good thing. It should be portrayed in movies, but it isn't. So reality in teaching children in the modern world is what we're really thinking, what we present children with entertainment with. So you could argue that the only message given by entertainment could be negated by the strong hand of a parent or a good public school, the American kind, not the posh British kind. But most children don't get those opportunities. They never get to come to Trinity, they never get to stand here, and they're brought up, as sad as it is, by television and movies. I've worked with 7th graders in the United States who don't know how to read, but they have a television. So Harry Potter is great, but if you can't read, all you get is what you see on TV. So as much as we don't like it, television ends up being sort of like a babysitter. Movies are a babysitter because parents work all day and maybe they study at night, they have to cook dinner. They don't have time to explain to their children that what happens on TV isn't what happens in real life. I remember watching the first episode of Game of Thrones with my parents when my mother pulled me aside and said a consensual loving relationship does not look like that. So the effect of the influence of entertainment on children can't be negated. The entertainment industry is all some children get, and they're not really filtering it in a way that allows them to see that perhaps this isn't reality. We're also going to talk about realistic portrayals. Like Lord of the Flies is a realistic portrayal of adolescent boys on an island, but in Hollywood it would have gotten a happy ending. But instead, with that happy ending, with the happily ever after, you don't get get to grapple with the idea of what happens when people are just left on their own. Maybe people actually are intrinsically terrible. We'll never know. So we need to be able to theoretically grapple with the implications of evil triumphing over good in order to understand why we need good to triumph over evil in daily life. Because you can't theoretically grapple with something that you've never even thought of or encountered, especially when you're a child. Giving children narratives of good triumphing over evil shows them that when they encounter evil in daily life, that there is no mythical hero coming to save them, because there are no heroes, only ordinary people who work who work with courage and a sense of what's right and act collectively to make sure that evil deeds aren't able to be carried out in this world. And we do children a disservice by overwhelming their narrative with good triumphing over evil, because then they don't know how and when to react. I want to talk about recent politics for a second, because it does carry on into adulthood. The reason Brexit happened, the reason Donald Trump happened, no one, even the people who voted for those things, expected them to happen, because they were never forced to encounter a reality where the bad thing might happen. The fact that our actions do have consequences, because there is no mythical hero that's going to come along and save the day. Things are real in the real world, and they're not in this fantasy land that Disney has tried to cram down your throats for the last 100 years. But we also need to talk, the rise of racism. No one ever thought that bad things could be defeated and then come back, because that's not something that we present to them in films. We need to give people, children especially, a more realistic portrayal of what life is like. And if no one had to do with these before, they can't really handle it. So calling someone good also doesn't leave room for nuance, because we indicate that everything they've done has ever been good. We simplify what they are, but you could call the rebellion in Star Wars is good, but they still had Princess Leia marching around in a metal bra, which I think was a bad thing. Or Disney still sexualizes Disney princesses, which is a horrible message for children, but when you tell them that that's also good, you teach them that that's okay, and we can't let that happen. Can you believe that Shrek was groundbreaking just because the characters are ugly and Scottish and there's an ass shown on TV? It has nothing to do with good triumphing over evil. This is all basically about what they have provided is escapism that isn't necessary, and it's better to take our comfort in real life than to luxuriate in fantasy. It's better to grapple with evil entertainment than to build a better reality. When I'm training for a race, I don't jog slower than my race pace most of the time and then kind of try the other times. I run harder than I'll need to run in the race, so that when I finally am confronted with a challenge, I know that I can do it. And I believe that our children are strong enough to grapple with these things, so I'm very proud to propose today.
Thank you, Sarah, for her fine words, and I'd like to call on Catherine Kelly
that they are wrong, and I'm going to go on and prove this within my speech. So first things first, I'm going to argue with Daniel, because I figure that's a good place to start. So Daniel seems to have this vision of children as these people who are completely sheltered, who, their parents don't show them the real world, and, children's entertainment doesn't show them the real world, and they see nothing. I would argue that children see the hardship of their parents from a very young age. Children watch their parents struggle to afford Christmas. Children maybe watch, if they have parents who are immigrants, they watch their parents struggle with that. Children definitely see a lot more of the real world than Daniel likes to believe that they do. I also think that Daniel suggests that characters walk into happy endings. I don't see this in most of the children's entertainment that I read as a child. Like Harry Potter definitely does not have an easy time, right? Takes them quite a while to get there. 7 books, like 9 movies, come on, do you know? I also think, good triumphing over evil literally has nothing to do with damsels in distress. We see Katniss, we see Hermione, we see strong female characters, part of the good, triumphing over the evil, no thank you, all the time within children's entertainment today. Like, we have progressed, do you know? I also think that this grey that he would have us portray is problematic, and I'm going to go on to that within my speech and hopefully show you why he's wrong then. I also think, there's been a lot of emphasis within both Daniel and Sarah's speeches on how we should be showing kids the truth, how we should be showing them reality. Why? That's my question, And again, I'm going to talk about that within my speech. But I ultimately think that if lying to kids makes them better people, we should just lie to kids. So, again, I'll get on to that. So, I think as well, the onus is on Prop here to prove to us that a world without these happy endings would be better than the world in which we exist. And I think that they failed to characterize what having, fewer happy endings actually does for the world. Go for it.
Do you think on your side of the house you deprive children an additional mechanism for coping when life doesn't go so right for them, but all the characters that they look to seem to have perfect endings?
I think that children, again, don't walk into happy endings, and also not all happy endings are perfectly happy, but again, I will get into this. So I think the cynicism we've been shown on proposition leaves us with just 2 options: to have evil triumph over good, or to have no clear good and evil. In response to these kind of arguments that I feel they should have made, I will discuss the importance of having a clear and distinct good and a clear and distinct evil, and then I will discuss the importance of this good triumphing over that evil. So firstly, on having a distinct good and a distinct evil, when we teach kids morals, we don't say, okay, it's okay to lie in certain circumstances, but generally you shouldn't lie. And you should say no thank you sometimes, but you shouldn't say no other times. Instead we say, don't lie. We say please, we say thank you. We make it clear, we make it easy for them. I don't see why this should be different in entertainment. I think that when we blur the lines, we make it incredibly complex for a child to deal with. I think that when we have these sort of grey characters, because ultimately when we talk about like grey morality, we're kind of personifying that within characters. We encourage kids to relate to characters who commit harms, who do things that we don't want them to do within their own lives. And children do follow the examples that are set for them. So I think it's important that we show children like a lovable good and a loathsome evil. And so they say, okay, well, and I can see that good succeeds most of the time, so I'm going to do what's morally right because that will lead to success for me. Because ultimately, I think it's important that children are morally correct, and I think that if we're showing them these blurred sort of lines, we're showing them grey, or we're showing them evil triumphing over good, we're not incentivizing good behaviour, right? I also think we should look at the way in which good is characterised versus the way in which evil is characterised. So, good is often actually just moral perseverance. So let's take a look at Harry Potter, and let's take a look at Tom Riddle. Both have quite similar starts in life, right? Both orphaned, both have pretty, unpleasant carers who don't really care about them. Tom Riddle succumbs, he allows himself to be hardened, he becomes Voldemort, right? Whereas Harry Potter makes a choice to remain good, to be morally righteous, right? It is important, it is not easy for him to make this choice. He could choose to be evil, but he makes that choice. I think that that's frequently the way in which we see good characterized, that being good is a choice. And I think it's important that children see characters making this difficult choice to be good, so that they see that when that succeeds, this is the kind of choice that they should be making within their own lives, right? I don't care whether this is true or not, because ultimately, if kids end up being, more moral towards one another, if kids end up doing more good as a result of this, then I think we've, achieved our goal.
On that point.
Go for it.
So this is basically the status quo that you're describing. So why aren't children more moral now if this is all cool?
well, why aren't children more moral now? You're right in saying that it's the status quo, so I don't have a basis for comparison. But what I really want to know is, why would children be more moral on your side of the house, you know? Because ultimately I believe you should be trying to prove to us that your world is better than the world in which we live, and I haven't heard any of that so far. So, I think that it's important that we show kids that moral perseverance wins, that if you act to help others, you will win. It may not be easy. As I've stated, it takes Harry 7 books to defeat Dumbledore. You know, Barry B. Benson in B-Movie, sure, he has a whole case that turns out to be pretty much irrelevant, right? But again, he chooses to persevere, to look to, you know, helping the bees out, and, you know, ultimately he gets his happy ending. And I think that that's important, right? I also think it's important we kind of contextualize children's entertainment in like the broader scheme of things. So within adult entertainment, we still, like, for the most part, have happy endings. Like, when I watch Law & Order SVU, I like to see the criminal caught at the end. Do you know what I mean? When I read a book, I like to see a happy ending. Why should we be giving children a different standard? Do you know what I mean? Why should we be saying, well, you don't get your happy ending, or you get your sort of grey, unclear morality? I think we need to be giving them happy endings. We need to be as well comforting them, because again, these are children. And I know Prop likes to have you believe that, you know, we can raise children on this sort of grey morality, and that maybe this will help them to better fight racism in the future. I don't really see why, because if they don't see a clear good, succeeding, triumphing, being key to success, what is going to incentivize them to be good in their own lives? And really, I think that that's what this debate should be about, how we can affect the morals of children through our sort of showing them this morality within children's entertainment. And really, that's why I'm very, very, very proud to oppose.
We thank Catherine for her fine words, and I'd like to call on Catherine Doherty to speak for the proposition.
Hello, my 2 main points today are going to be the myth of good and evil and the power of storytelling in shaping our reality. So basically, proposition, we have a problem with good triumphing over evil because we basically consider these distinctions to be irresponsible inflations of actual human experience. Because in children's literature, what you have are like the good guys, okay, and then they may experience some hardship, like, yeah, Harry did have 7 books, but like at the end there's this one pivotal moment where you're like, seamlessly changes, and then your life is completely void of any evil, and, you know, happily ever after. And like, we acknowledge that it's very tempting to tell kids these stories with like very strong classifications of good and evil, because so like when we tell children these stories, it's gratifying for parents that they're going to be extremely responsive to these categorizations, because because children's literature can date so far back, and like it carries with it a lot of outdated notions, like this can be very damaging. So like what makes this toxic is that these portrayals of good and evil are totally arbitrary, and obviously perpetuates like nonsensical ideas of goodness and morality. So in the case of Cinderella, she's beautiful and soft-spoken, and her prince is fabulously handsome, and meanwhile like the bad guys are her ugly stepsisters. We don't think this helps mitigate false narratives that exist in society in which we equate goodness with beauty and ugliness with evil. Okay, and we also think that good triumphing over evil is just hyper-sensationalized and tends to ignore the more painful reality of like the road to triumph that even exists. We think by ignoring inevitable stages to the journey to accomplishment that we overlook things like failure and self-doubt. We see this as valuable aspects that deserve a part in the story to tell our children. We believe that when we plant outdated and romanticized ideals of triumph into the minds of the most malleable and seemingly legitimized. Like, we don't think good's triumph is like protective or offering some sort of elusive hope, like in response to Catherine and Naomi's speech. Like, we acknowledge that we shouldn't expose children to like all about the world, like full or scandalous about blurring the lines of what success and good and evil mean. Like, we think that this is really different from like stopping children. I'll take you at the end of my point. Stopping children from watching 18s films. Like, we know that children aren't going to be mentally ready to like watch a really graphic sex scene or a really violent war scene. Like, this is something really different. This is a question of morality, something that's that goes way deeper. Yeah.
You mentioned this idea of it not being shameful. We're not saying it's shameful, and we're not saying it's a bad thing. We're saying, how is your side any better? You're not proving that to us.
Well, I'll get to that later in my point when I talk about how storytelling can shape the way that we think, and how on our side of the house, that when we shape it to the way that we like, that will cause children to be more thoughtful and more insightful in a way that's better for them in their developmental journey. Okay, so there's this idea of like hope, that they need some sort of this idea that there's a kind of a good force in the world that completely doesn't exist. Like, we don't think that this offers any sort of hope, but it just kind of perpetuates a sort of delusion. Like, we think hope implies possibility, and the good triumphing over evil in literature is overwhelmingly unrealistic. Like, we think that this eliminates any possibility and therefore any hope. We say that hope and delusion aren't synonymous. We actually think delusion is detrimental. This delusion that I'm talking about is like detrimental in the way that we deal with the very multifaceted grey experience that is real life. Like, we think having a militant dichotomy between good and evil that exists in your consciousness is really destructive. Like, we think that kids, when they're dealing with somewhat negative experiences, that they can spiral out of control in their own minds and cause really catastrophic things. These norms. So like, if you take that new film Inside Out, for example, we have emotions like sadness, being as relevant, as valuable, and as central to the plot as like the emotion of joy, and not just like the bad part of the film that you have to go through. So basically, we know that kids aren't masterminds, and they won't be able to, and they won't be able to dissect these caricatures of good and evil and come up with a happy medium in their own heads, like of what that could symbolize in reality. But what we do say is that if we presented them like a less ruthless villain and a more fallible hero and a less all-conclusive sense of closure and happy endings, that their triumphs in reality would be all the more rewarding. Okay, on to my next point. Yeah.
Do you not think we still get nuance in, say, for example, Voldemort? He is still a flawed character, where we can come to understand it and understand that he'd choose to be evil, and do you not think that that's a valuable thing to show?
Well, but like, I think that you really like Harry Potter as an example. I'm saying overwhelmingly, you seem to really like that, but like, J.K. Rowling, I'll admit, she's a very progressive author, but predominantly what's the most conventional narratives, that's the old story, that's the old fiction. Okay, so there's this idea that escapism, they're going to have their values from their parents. Like, we say that opposition are underestimating the power that storytelling has, is that it is not merely a means of escapism or exploring one's imagination. We say that the stories we're told as kids can and do have a significant impact on the way that we interpret everyday life. And the good defeating evil narrative is something that plays out in daily conversation. We say that storytelling has been used as a device for literalizing everyday emotions since the beginning of spoken word. So when I experience life and I feel myself like respond externally through storytelling, and we think that these extreme storytelling devices are used to add drama or to embellish a narrative, and that these really extreme devices are heard in everyday conversation. And then they go to tell a really exaggerated stories featuring themselves, the protagonist, and like the villain or the evil just miraculously transcended this. We said that people tend to imagine good and evil forces of consciousness, and in a common way people make sense of their life is through a kind of inner narrative that plays out in their own minds. And just bringing this back to the motion, we think it's impossible that children will be capable of recognizing these inflated ideas as merely storytelling device, really lazy way of taking advantage of a child's naivety. In response to Catherine of let's lie to kids, no, I think that's entirely irresponsible. And actually, we think that children would be very capable of a deeper empathy, okay? Because kids aren't going to be capable of contextualizing the relativity of these exaggerated narratives, so what we absorb at a young age can change our lives in a way that is entirely unconscious. It's a grey life, but it's an okay.
I'd like to call on Andy Hartley now to speak for the opposition.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to debunk a few red herrings that we've heard from the proposition. Firstly, on, I think it was Sarah's point, you were sort of saying how Brexit and Trump have come from this narrative of good and evil. I don't think I'm from Britain, and I don't think happily ever afters have anything, if you watch Happily Ever After Have a Child, have anything to do with Trump. That is a completely different kettle of fish. That's nationalism. That's frankly lying to the British public. On to another point. I think, Afrik, you're underestimating children's ability to tell the difference between good and evil, and what's fantasy, what's fiction, and to take the good morals from that and use them in everyday life. And I think underestimating also the power of the school system to educate children on what is, and sort of teenagers as they move on in sort of, stop being children and move on to university into what is sort of good and what is evil. Now, onto my own speech. Looking at sort of 3 points. First of all, how there is nuance in children's entertainment, and it does show some very harsh things. Then how entertainment is evolving, and you are getting more sort of round characters, as it were, not just sort of flat, one-sided, stereotypical depictions. And then onto how these role models that you see in children's entertainment build a moral framework that you can abide by for the rest of your life, which I think is a very good thing. So, hunger, bereavement, bullying, powerlessness, terror, despair, and even torture feature in children's books. Children's entertainment does not deny that this happens, but the adult world knows that it can be so much worse than how it is depicted. But because children's entertainment has kindness and love to soften this blow, children learn that it can be endured and it can be overcome. Television programs, movies, books have artistic license free from censorship, and that is a good thing. They can show evil, but they also need to show the triumph over evil. Why do adults return to children's entertainment when they are at their most vulnerable, their most stressed or sad? Because it provided them with reassurance when they were young. Adults go and watch Bond movies or superhero films because they know that in this form of entertainment, I will take you at the end, they do not even question if the hero will survive. Yes.
Just because people return to something doesn't comment to its quality. Bond films aren't children's entertainment, they're incredibly sexist. Like, my mother returns to Gone with the Wind, which is horribly racist. How would you respond to that?
I would say that my mother read Winnie the Pooh when she was writing her dissertation because she was incredibly stressed and scared, and it provided comfort because it took her back to her childhood roots. And moving on to an actual example from children's entertainment about how, it's not always, children's entertainment isn't always a snap of the fingers. Gandalf in The Hobbit, a great book, says that some believe it is only great power that can hold evil in check. But that is not what I have found. It is the small, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay. Small acts of kindness and love. In general, a child cannot hold great power, and they do generally feel small and powerless, and they have a thirst for justice. They have clear concepts of what is good and bad, and watching a character on screen tell you that the little things in life you do matter can be very comforting and empowering. Perhaps this is slightly naive, but in the end it gives the guidance to children that they may not have had otherwise, and that they might not have been able to absorb in any other way. When Gandalf tells them on screen that the little acts they do make them a better person, give them this moral framework, that encourages one child to make more positive decisions. I think, how can that be a bad thing? Why should the narrative of good triumphing over evil not happen? And now onto evolving entertainment. The evil...
children don't believe themselves fundamentally bad in the absence of entertainment. They believe themselves to be good anyway. So insofar as it changes behaviour, I just stay the way I am because I'm good now. But now individual responsibility isn't that important because it'll just work out well anyway. Because good people win and I'm a good person. But I don't change my behaviour necessarily because people don't believe themselves to be morally bad.
Children don't always feel that they're a good person. They can be in a very low spot. What if you're being bullied at school? It can big you up. It can sort of show you that you are a better person if you're in a hard place. And the evil or negative things shown in children's entertainment, they can show that it's ultimately better for a child's well-being if good pulls through in the end. And I think children's entertainment is moving on from the stereotypes of sort of Disney movies. You don't just have the sort of flat pantomime villain anymore. You have the round character, the flawed character who recovers from these flaws and prevails. Children's entertainment has and is evolving to be less black and white. And that you know, if you cannot tell who the goodies and baddies are, the narrative still allows the marginally more preferable one to succeed. And finally, onto the imitation and role models. Children's entertainment promotes a good message about family, and it builds a moral framework to abide by for the rest of your life. What we see is what we replicate when we are young. If a child sees it, they will want to become or imitate this figure that is central to the plot line and ultimately sort of succeeds, that wins. What motivates adults are the stories they are told as children. And even the most basic stereotypes of good triumphing told in stories or replicated in films have important lessons. If you have a troubled childhood, perhaps one dominated by conflict, violence, abuse, or even trouble from the school bully, positive entertainment can provide a means of escape. Why should children's entertainment not be different when they have to deal with different problems to adults? They need to realise that the struggle is hard. Dobby might die along the way. Cinderella may have to scrub pots and pans for a good few years, but there is hope of good prevailing if you work hard. The fact that as children they were given positive narratives to counter the bad in the real world and try and strive to recreate them outside the sphere of entertainment. I beg you to oppose.
thank Conor O'Malley for his fine speech. I'd now like to call on the final speaker in the debate, Mr. Luke Bealey for the opposition.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, I promise not to quote Friedman because he's an economist and I don't agree with what he says. But in my capacity as opposition whip, I'm going to sum up this debate by providing fresh framing. I firmly believe that the key to this debate is the question, how does the happily ever after ending affect kids? In short, think of the children! So let's apply the arguments both sides have made to the mind of a child. Now, it may surprise some of you, but I myself was once a child. And there's a certain episode from my childhood that I want to use for analysis. So, once upon a time, far, far away in the People's Republic of Cork, there were two young children. Twins, in fact, who had come in off the water after a long day sailing. Cold and wet we were, my sister and I, and we wanted nothing more than some hot food and maybe a shower to warm up. So once the boat were rigged, so drenched and shivering were we, that we decided to trudge up the hill to Grandparents' Feely for some food, perhaps even a shower. And we arrived to the top of Fairy Hill, and there was the house. The raging music wafting through the open windows seemed to invite us in. And we knocked on the door. No answer. We rang the bell. No answer. Unsurprising, really. They're about as deaf as Connor is, judging from the amount of POIs he took. But both cars were outside, and as I said, we could hear the radio. So they must be in, we thought. Anyway, so we took off our boots and we hopped through one of these open windows, and no one seemed to be around. Which really just meant that there was no one there to see us pry the lid off the biscuit tin and raid it with our sailing knives, really. And it was precisely halfway through my fourth custard cream that the house alarm went off. And ladies and gentlemen, before the situation had even registered with me, I was gone. Instinct took over, and I fled back out that open window. I left my knife still spinning on the kitchen floor next to a small mountain of crumbs and a stricken sister. Once out, I didn't even stop to put on my boots. Barefoot, I fled down one of the steepest hills in the Greater Cork region. In fact, to this day, I still hold the local land speed record. Now, entertaining as this image is, why is it relevant? Believe me, I'm trying. It was relevant because of my mindset at the time. I didn't have the experience or the common sense, in fact I still don't, to realise that I would not be locked up for the rest of my life. In my child's mind, I saw myself being led past forecourts with a hood over my head on the 9 o'clock news, convicted of robbing an elderly couple's abode armed with a sailing knife. And I couldn't see how this tricky situation could resolve itself favourably. I imagined the Gestapo swooping in to nab the sister I'd abandoned. In the distance, I could still hear the wail of the alarm. And now the proposition would have you believe that happily ever after hadn't equipped me to deal with the situation. That the next chapter sees me rig my boat and sail out of the mouth. No, thank you. Denied. And sail out of the mouth of the harbour, set a heading for the horizon, and never return. Or simply throw myself overboard. And that encountering opposition when I'd been told that everything would be perfectly rosy would cause me to crack. And without hope, I don't doubt that this assessment would be accurate. But ingrained in me from an early age, right next to the Cork belief that De Valera was the most evil man who ever lived, was the message that things get better, that it all works out. And so I followed the fairy tale formula in which collaborative good beats evil. And I went to the good witch of Monkstown for help, in this case a friend's mother. And she calmed me down, and she gave me some biscuits to replace the half-eaten custard cream I'd abandoned. More important than my sister, obviously. And she drove me back to my grandparents' house to help sort out the... No, thank you, Connor. And I vividly remember the moment that my sister caught sight of me sitting in the passenger seat, munching happily away on a jammy dowdger. No, thank you. And the Gaudi did eventually arrive, but we explained the story, and it was fine. The alarm was turned off, and no one was arrested for raiding the biscuit tin. It ended happily ever after. And after hearing this little tale, what do you think is the most important message we can give our children?
On that point?
No, thank you. Is it that the world is full of harms and dangers? That someday life might... Connor, no, thank you. That someday life might roundhouse kick you in the face? Should we teach them that sometimes you just can't win? No, we shouldn't. We give them hope. We should raise them on the message that good nearly always triumphs, even if that's not strictly true. We should tell them that if things are bad, then the story isn't over. So at the first sound of alarm bells, they don't sail off into the west. Prop can stand up here and they can say, or they can give you a tenuous link to racism, or maybe a few frantic faces about the dichotomy of good and evil and how we should all read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Or they might even give you an attack on a straw man argument about children's entertainment as like that it should be so diverse and this is where we're damaging art using this. But frankly, these harms are negligible, simply because hope, and by extension, the happily ever after ending, keeps us going. At least we're still here. Now, in the last 2 weeks, 16 Cork teenagers have died by suicide. One girl, she was 17, she was our neighbour. And I used to pass her out on the hill when I went for my walk, and we chat away. And she killed herself because she thought that things could not get better. That the struggles she faced were insurmountable. So when I see emotion about happy endings, I'm compelled to support. I'm compelled to support the fairy tale, not because it's true, but because when Hansel and Gretel are about to be eaten, or when Han Solo was killed, or when Frodo was alive but taken by the enemy, it's the belief in a happy ending that keeps us turning the pages. And Happily Ever After gives us the strength to keep writing our own stories. Let Jack believe that someday he'll look older than 12. Let Ruth believe that communism will one day be a viable model for an economy. Let Ronan believe that I won't stab in the back as an auditor. Of course, none of these things are true, but I'm sure it keeps them going. And if you think that we're not prepping kids for the real world, you're wrong, because we've given them the best defence we can. I know life can be shit and still get better, but 10-year-old Luke on Fairy Hill didn't, and it was the fairy tale logic, the fairy tale belief, which kept him going and kept him asking for help. How can we regret the overwhelming narrative of good triumphing over evil in children's literature when it gives us the will to live? And here we are now, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the Hist Maiden story. And it's a happy ending, mainly because I've brought jammy dodgers. And I have never been so proud to oppose motion. Thank you very much.